Hey everyone, Darcy here. This video got away from me. I kind of devolve into mini deck techs. So rapid fire list is not here. Maybe check the description. If I'm smart, I put it down there. But if you're interested in a bunch of mini deck techs, like 10 mini deck techs, I think you'll enjoy it. This was a really fun video to make, and hopefully the length doesn't scare you off. I'll see you at the end of the video. Hello, I'm Darcy Bits, and it's time for another Top 10 Pauper Commander review, this time for the Fallout set. The Fallout set was distributed as 4 Commander precons, which means that since the deck lists are set, there's really no need for rarity. But the Fallout set is also being distributed by collector boosters. Collector boosters are booster packs, so rarity has actually been assigned to all new cards. None of the new cards from the set are common, but there are plenty of uncommon creatures we can discuss for Pauper Commander potential. Pauper Commander is played with 99 commons in your deck and 1 uncommon creature as your commander. No need for them to be legendary.
Sit back and enjoy as we take a look at the top 10 new Pauper Commanders from Fallout.
First, we have Gary Clone. Yes, if you wanted Gary as your commander, you can do that in Pauper Commander. Gary Clone is a 2-mana, 1/3 human citizen with Squad 2. Whenever Gary Clone attacks, each creature you control named Gary Clone gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Squad 2 means that when you cast it, you may pay an additional 2 mana any number of times. You make that many token copies. So if you're able to sink a lot of mana into Gary Clone, you can end up with a ton of them. As a 1/3 body, it's pretty decent. You're going to be able to wall a lot of things. As much as I needed to talk about Gary in this video, I don't know how strong this actually is going to be. It's very cool to be able to generate a lot of mana and have a sink. We have seen X spells in the past be used to great effect in this way. And being completely colorless mana to squad up, you can have a very colorless focused deck and generate a ton of colorless mana to play Gary in the mid to late game. How effective this is going to be, I'm not entirely sure. And other than when they die, you're not really getting to cast them again. If they do die, you're gonna have to pay commander tax, so you're getting 1 less clone. It just doesn't really seem like it works that well to me. There are a number of bounce effects in white that can target your own creatures, but very rarely is this giving you any benefit. It's just putting it back into your hand to cast again. The benefit of a lot of these cards is that they have alternate uses usually, like you're ambushed on the road, a 1-mana instant that can either return a creature to your hand or can give a creature +1/+3 until end of turn. Or Light the Way, a 1-mana instant that can let you bounce something to your hand, or put a +1/+1 counter on a creature and untap it. Again, these alternate uses are pretty fringe relevant, but it does mean that if you don't want to spend that mana to bounce a card to your hand, they're not just dead cards, so maybe something to consider. If you can cast Gary Clones for 10 and then do it again the following turn by bouncing them to your hand, you could end up with a pretty wide board, all buffing each other. The fact that the wider this goes, the bigger each Gary is really, really cool. Number 9 is Cathedral Acolyte, a 2-mana, 1/2 human cleric. Each creature you control with a counter on it has ward 1. You can then tap them to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature that entered the battlefield this turn. There are a lot of cards in green, in common, that benefit from counters, create counters, or care about you controlling creatures with counters. The first ability of Cathedral Acolyte is more just nice. It's not a huge deal, it's not why you play it, but it is going to make your board a bit stickier. It's going to put a wrinkle into your opponent's plans. It's going to pay off. The second ability allows you to put a counter on a creature that entered the battlefield this turn. Because it's a tap ability, you're only going to really be able to do this once, but it pseudo gives all of your creatures this enters with a +1/+1 counter. Of course, only the first each turn, but that's probably okay. One of the benefits of having a commander that hands out +1/+1 counters across your board means you can go wide with your counters and then start proliferating. Green has a ton of proliferate effects that are going to feel very, very good in this deck. There are certainly other commanders in green that care about +1/+1 counters that you could be using instead, but generally speaking, they are going to be giving extra counters to themselves and go tall. If you want to go with a proliferate game plan, you really want to be handing out those counters across the board. The card that Cathedral Acolyte probably has to compete with the most is Contortionist Troop. This is for X and a green, either a 0/0 that enters with X +1/+1 counters. Then at the beginning of each of your end steps, if you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So they are also going to be able to hand out these counters no matter where you want to send them. The downside is that you have to have Coven, that's having 3 or more creatures with different powers. But on the upside, they get to do it immediately. Cathedral Acolyte can only do it as a tap ability, can only target things that enter the battlefield this turn. Another option is Obsessive Skinner, a 2-mana 1/1 that when it enters the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. Then, at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. So once again, it is adding counters to your board in a targeted way. And in this case, it's even potentially doing it 3 times per round, since it happens on each opponent's upkeep. Similar to the Contortionist Troop, it has the downside of needing to be set up first. How early in the game can you expect to actually have Delirium? Have 4 different card types among cards in your graveyard? I'm not really sure. Cathedral Acolyte has the benefit of coming down on turn 2 and getting to start tapping as soon as turn 3. That is potentially going to give them a space to live despite the competition. Next, at number 8, we have Gunner Conscript. This is a 2-mana 2/2 with Trample. It also gets +1/+1 for each aura and equipment attached to it. This baseline is so good. Like, 2-mana 2/2 with Trample that then gets even bigger when you put stuff on it. This is a scary, scary Voltron commander. If we take a look at this effect and try and find alternate commanders that could fill the same role, there really isn't much. Probably the closest example would be something like Gatherer of Graces, a 2-mana 1/2 that gets +1/+1 for each aura attached to it. But this is aura and equipment, and it's a better starting point, and it has Trample. It's just across the board so good. The benefit of Gatherer of Graces is that it protects itself. You can sacrifice an aura to regenerate Gatherer of Graces, so they're both doing things a little bit differently. The other card that you need to know about because, well, it's funny, honestly, is Rabid Wombat. Yes, the only official Wombat in Magic the Gathering, a 4-mana 0/1 with Vigilance that gets +2/+2 for each aura attached to it. I mean, that's growing a lot. +2/+2 is huge. But once again, auras, not auras and equipment. Despite there not being a lot of competition yet uncommon, there are a decent number of common cards that can go into this archetype. For example, Golem Skin Gauntlets is a 1-mana equipment that gives the equipped creature +1/+0 for each equipment attached to it. There's also Aura Gnarlid, which is a 3-mana 2/2 that gets +1/+1 per aura on the battlefield at all. So you can throw Aura Gnarlid down and then put a bunch of auras on Gunner Conscript, and they're actually going to both be able to benefit from that situation. Number 7 is Vexing Radgull. This one I'm legitimately really excited about. So Vexing Radgull is a 2-mana 1/2 bird mutant with flying. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player gets 2 rad counters. If they already have rad counters, you will instead proliferate. Rad counters are a new mechanic from Fallout, which, as usual, means if you want something that interacts with this mechanic, Pauper's not the place for you. There's no common cards that care about rad counters. But what rad counters do might be relevant. Rad counters basically mean that at the beginning of your upkeep, if you have a rad counter, you mill that many, and then for each non-land card you milled, you take damage and lose that many rad counters. This card will remind you of Thrumming Bird, I am sure, which is basically identical, except it's a 1/1, and there's no rad counters thing, it just always proliferates. Thrumming Bird is available as an uncommon creature, so it could totally be your commander. So why is Vexing Radgull exciting? Well, because Thrumming Bird's been printed at common as well, which means it can go into the 99 of this deck. Throw in a Guild Pact Informant into the 99, and you've got 3 creatures that all proliferate when they deal combat damage to a player. I think that's going to be really, really cool and really, really consistent. I don't see this as being a deck that really cares about milling your opponents and making sure your opponents have a full graveyard. There are some common blue cards that care if your opponents have like 8 or more cards in their graveyard, but it's not a big deal. Still, it's going to be a pretty decent chip damage throughout the game, especially if you don't have anything else to proliferate yet on turn 3 and 4 when you've just played Vexing Radgull. So while it's really easy to look at that first ability as a downside, I don't get to start proliferating until you already have rad counters, I think it's actually going to be a better situation overall. Proliferation decks are super fun in mono blue. My first Pauper deck was a Flux Channeler deck that just proliferated all the time, and it was super fun. With Vexing Radgull, I really want to build a deck called 3-Bird that runs the Gull, the Bird, and the Guild Pact Informant for 3 proliferating attackers. There's definitely enough cards in common in blue that care about counters being proliferated, whether they're +1/+1 counters or charge counters for artifacts. Just plenty of uses. It's going to be great. Number 6 is Bighorner Rancher, a 5-mana 2/5 green vigilance creature. It taps to add an amount of green mana equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. I don't know if there's a lot more to be said about this. It's just a really big mana dork, and it's going to give you a lot of mana. You're in green, you want to cast some big stuff. This is going to be a great commander for those decks. What's interesting about Bighorner Rancher is that we can make a direct comparison with Alena Kessig Trapper. Alena is a 5-mana red 4/3 with first strike. They can tap to add an amount of red mana equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. Except that creature must have entered the battlefield this turn. So not only is Alena more narrow in its application, it's also, well, it's in red. Now, Alena does have Partner, which means you can have a second commander, so you could very easily also be in green. In fact, that is the design of the card, if I'm not mistaken, especially considering their canonical partner. But if you want to be making a predominantly green deck, you really want to be making green mana. I don't think I need to tell you about how powerful Ramp is in a green deck, based off of the power of the big green creatures that green wants to be playing. It's a big things matter deck in green, which there's actually surprisingly little support for in the command zone. Number 5 is the Lumbering Megasloth. Speaking of big dumb things in green, Lumbering Megasloth is a 12-mana 8/8 with Trample. However, it costs 1 less to cast for each counter among permanents and players. It also enters tapped, so downside to go with your upside. So this card is just an 8/8 with Trample. There's no additional build around here, there's no synergy, it's just a big boy. But what a big boy it is. And the fact that this can get discounted to as low as 2 mana is terrifying. Now, I was looking for options for possibly flinging this at your opponent or something like that so that you could then recast it again, because let's not forget, discounts apply to commander attacks as well. So even when this dies, it's coming right back. The strongest thing about Lumbering Megasloth, I think, is going to be its stickiness. You play it, it gets killed, you play it again. The fact that it is tapped down is going to suck. Do not get me wrong, but you're going to be very consistent at being able to play this out cheaply. Even though this isn't a super interesting effect to build around, it does require support from the rest of the deck, which does mean your deck is going to have a cohesive theme. Once again, it's counters mattering in green, which is just tried and true. We're seeing it a lot. What makes Lumbering Megasloth special is that it's not just +1/+1 counters. It's not even counters on permanents only. It's counters on players. This is likely intended to be combined with rad counters, but as we mentioned previously, we don't have that as an option here. But we do have energy counters. Energy counters can be ridiculous in a really explosive deck, but most of the time they're actually pretty efficient to get and do very, very little. The thing is, we really don't care if we don't have a good use of the energy. Since we count the number of counters there are every time we play the Megasloth, we really want to be hoarding our counters, not using our counters. And having them on us means they're a lot harder for our opponents to interact with. If a creature in play has a +1/+1 counter on it, you kill that creature. If you have an energy counter, there's not really anything they can do about it. Consulate Turret, for example, is a 3-mana artifact that can tap to give you an energy counter. Even if you do nothing with that, you are banking an energy counter every single turn, and they are not going away. Another way to get extra counters in play is with artifacts that care about charge counters. Now, oftentimes you're going to be inning charge counters and spending charge counters, so it's not super relevant, but some cards just make counters with no real use for them. For example, Surge Note is a 1-mana artifact that enters with 6 charge counters on it. The idea is that you can then move those counters onto other artifacts that care, but we can just hoard all 6 of those counters and discount Lumbering Megasloth by 6. Another route to go is hoarding counters until we get the Megasloth down, and then we start spending them. Golden Urn and Golem Foundry are perfect for this. Golden Urn giving you an extra counter every one of your upkeeps, and Golem Foundry getting a counter whenever you cast an artifact spell. In both cases, you could happily hoard these counters, and then in the late game, just spend all of them to have a huge boost of power out of nowhere. In the case of Golden Urn, you tap and sacrifice it to gain life equal to the number of charge counters on it. So you kind of want to be hoarding it anyway. Golem Foundry, on the other hand, you can remove 3 charge counters from it to make a 3/3. If you just need to spend all of the counters on it in one go, you can do that. There's no tap required, there's no limit to the number of times you can spend this. So you just hoard counters on Golem Foundry, and if someone says, okay, you've been definitely discounting your Megasloth way too much this game, I'm going to blow up your Golem Foundry, you just remove all of the counters at instant speed and make a huge army of 3/3s. If you want to go less of an artifacts route and more of a green cards route, Talids are a great pick. Almost every Talid gets a spore counter every one of your upkeeps. You can then spend these spore counters, just like Golem Foundry, to make 1/1 saplings. It's a great way for these counters to be doing something productive until you have enough of them to really start going off. Once you've played the Lumbering Megasloth, they're just a big creature. I would love to be able to fling this at your opponent and just keep recasting it, but that's not really an option. That said, we do have Ram Through, a 2-mana instant that says target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. There's plenty of these types of effects in green at common that we could use to clean up our opponent's board pretty efficiently. But Ram Through is special because if you target a trampling creature with it, the damage tramples through as if it was attacking. This turns Ram Through into a pseudo fling, assuming your opponent has a random 1/1 lying around. And you get to keep the Megasloth. There's a decent number of bite and slash fight effects that care about +1/+1 counters or hand out +1/+1 counters, so their inclusion is perfectly reasonable in this deck without breaking the inherent theme. Maybe one of the most interesting cards to know about for Lumbering Megasloth specifically is Metamorphosis. This is an old card that's barely been reprinted. The Oracle text for it reads, as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature. Add X mana of any one color, where X is 1 plus the sacrificed creature's mana value. Spend this mana only to cast creature spells. So if you play Lumbering Megasloth for 2 mana, and then sacrifice it for 1 more mana, you have 13 mana floating, and can just cast them again. If you have enough to discount even through commander tax, it doesn't even matter that you're supposed to be paying 14 the next time you cast them. You can still just cast them again for 2. Have fun closing out the game from there. Number 4 is Butch DeLoria Tunnel Snake, a 2-mana 2/2 with Menace that has Tunnel Snake's Rule, which means whenever they attack, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each other rogue or snake you control, which is great. Good job, Wizards. They also can spend 2 mana to put a Menace counter on another target creature. That creature becomes a rogue. So let's tackle this first as a Rogues Matter card. Okay, snakes matter too. There's really not a ton of snakes in black, in common. You can include them for fun, but let's make a rogue deck around Butch DeLoria. There's a lot of rogues in black in common. There's a ton of them, and they're gonna each grow Butch. At first, I wasn't entirely sure how strong this would be. It's just growing Butch, and only when they attack. Otherwise, they're still a 2/2. But, well, if you're attacking with Butch, you aren't blocking with them. Do you really care they don't have the bonus the rest of the time? Probably not. It's certainly limiting, don't get me wrong, but if everything is going to plan, you're attacking with Butch DeLoria, not blocking with them. As you play more and more rogues, Butch DeLoria is just getting bigger and bigger. Since they have Menace, you're either 2 for 1 of your opponent, or you're getting through unblocked and dealing some significant commander damage. If you want to run any cards that aren't rogues, you can make them honorary rogues by having Butch welcome them to the gang for 2 mana. This also has the upside of giving them Menace. There's a lot of really cool cards that really wish they had Menace. Anything that wants to do combat damage to your opponent is going to really appreciate the Menace counter that Butch is handing out. It's really cool to see a Kindred strategy that isn't hyper-reliant on its one type, because anyone could be an honorary rogue with Butch. The card Butch really needs to compete with is Una's Blackguard, a 2-mana 1/1 fairy rogue with flying. They say that each other rogue you control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter. And whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it deals combat damage to a player, that player discards a card. A very different direction. It's very go wide instead of go tall. So which direction you'd rather go is really up to you. Definitely don't sleep on how powerful Menace can be, and don't sleep on how powerful handing out those counters and turning everyone into honorary rogues can be. I think Butch is going to actually be really strong, despite my first instincts. Number 3 is Legate Lanius, Kaiser's Ace, our first multicolor creature in the top 10. Being multicolor inherently gives a commander a little bit of an edge just by giving you a larger card pool to choose the best cards that go into the deck from. Legate Lanius is a 4-mana black and red 2/2 with Decimate. When Legate Lanius enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices a 10th of the creatures they control, rounded up. This is a very cute way of saying each opponent sacrifices a creature, but it does have some fringe upside. If your opponents have more than 10 creatures, they sacrifice 2. If they have more than 20 creatures, they sacrifice 3. It's actually a really surprisingly elegant design despite the wording. Their second ability is whenever an opponent sacrifices a creature, put a +1/+1 counter on Legate Lanius. This is super interesting for a number of reasons. First, if each opponent has at least one creature, when you play Legate Lanius, Legate is going to enter, cause each of your opponents to sacrifice something, and become a 5/5 for 4 mana. That's huge, actually. That could be backbreaking. That's a lot. To properly assess Legate Lanius, we need to look at other cards that grow in a similar way. There are a ton of cards that care about creatures dying or creatures being sacrificed, and Legate Lanius is unfortunately the most narrow version of all of those effects. They're not just when creatures die, they're not just when creatures are sacrificed, when creatures your opponents control are sacrificed. That is very limiting. But because of their ETB, I think it's probably worth it. Just the fact that all of these alternate cards are so small until you start the ball rolling is really detrimental to their success, I think. Legate Lanius being able to force 3 sacrifices out the gate and start as a 5/5 is legitimately really powerful and needs to be treated with respect. Despite the alternatives, I think this is going to be the best version of this archetype that we're going to have for a while. Number 2 is Craig Boone, Novac Guard, a 3-mana red and white 3/3 with reach and lifelink. First of all, that stat line is just really good. 3-mana 3/3 with lifelink is hard to find, honestly. Reach is just kind of gravy. That's excellent. Their ability is one from a baby. Whenever you attack with 2 or more creatures, put 2 quest counters on Craig Boone. When you do, deal damage equal to the number of quest counters on it to up to 1 target creature. A creature's controller may choose to take that damage instead. Yeah. The wording's pretty wordy, but basically, you elect one creature to die, and their controller can throw themselves in front of it, which is pretty cool, honestly. I really enjoyed the design of this card, being this, you choose somebody, and then the controller gets to decide if the creature's dead or they are. It's better than a forced sacrifice effect because you choose the creature that is dying. It's not like your opponent can just choose to have one of their 1/1s take the damage. No matter what happens, because of lifelink, you're always going to be getting something good out of the exchange, and being able to reliably do this every time you attack, if you have a wide enough board, really means you're going to be able to control the battlefield pretty strongly. Early game, people are going to take 2 damage, 4 damage. But late game, they're going to start wanting to let their creatures go. Now, arguably, you're going to wish you could still hit face late game, so it kind of sucks. But being able to just absolutely control the battlefield and gain some life to boot is going to be really good. It's important to note that this is whenever you attack with 2 or more creatures. Craig Boone does not need to be one of those creatures. So they can sit back and, well, block flyers, I guess. Other than just having a really good stat line and being a solid creature with a solid effect, I was really hoping to find some cool finisher for this game, something like a stuffy doll. You'll note it doesn't say target creature an opponent controls, so you could totally target your own thing if there's no other creatures in play. Oftentimes you're not going to want to do that, but it's cool that you can. If you had a stuffy doll, you could hit that creature and then blast your opponents for equal damage, which would be absolutely awesome, but that's not available in common. The closest thing we have is Coal Hauler Swine, a 6-mana 4/4 beast. This is very expensive, but if you're looking for a finisher, I think it's actually pretty reasonable. If Craig Boone is sitting on 8, 10 counters, which shouldn't be that hard as long as you protect them, since they're getting 2 counters at a time. You swing with 2 or more creatures once more, and blast the Coal Hauler Swine for, say, 10 damage. It doesn't even require any setup. You could have the Coal Hauler Swine in your hand the whole game, and no one would know it was coming. You'll note that it does deal damage to each player, but because of the lifelink, we don't care. Even if we're under the amount of damage that would kill us, the lifelink is going to trigger first, I think. Either way, with all of Craig Boone's lifelink the entire rest of the game,
You probably have the highest life. All in all,
this card looks really, really solid. You could even do some life gain matters if you wanted to, but honestly, there's not a lot of options in common. Now, before number 1, we've got a few honorable mentions. First is Crimson Caravaneer, a 3-mana 1/2 with double strike and trample. There's really just nothing to say about this card, but if you compare it to other cards with double strike and trample, you'll find there are none. At least not at uncommon. Well, there's one. It's from Murders at Karlov, and it's 6 mana. Load this up with equipment and auras, and you have a really scary Voltron strategy. Next, we have Blotfly Swarm. Once again, just really good stats. This is a 4-mana 0/0 with flying that enters with 5 +1/+1 counters on it. It has the downside of losing counters whenever damage would be dealt to it. So basically, damage it takes sticks around until it dies. If you're looking for another creature that has flying that is this big and this cheap, you're not going to have any luck without an even worse downside. The cards this is competing with are things like illusions that sacrifice themselves if they ever get targeted. This is legitimately a powerful card at this cost in the command zone with flying. Again, this is an honorable mention because it's just not that deep. It's just a big bug that's going to hit you in the air. And now for number 1. Young Deathclaws, a 4-mana, green and black, 4/2 lizard mutant with menace. Each creature card in your graveyard has Scavenge. The Scavenge cost is equal to its mana cost. I love this. Scavenge is a Golgari mechanic, Golgari the guild, not the color combination, that we really haven't seen a lot of. It means that you can exile the card from your graveyard by paying its Scavenge cost to put +1/+1 counters equal to its power on a single creature. In the past, Scavenge costs have been kind of an obscene amount of mana, but here, it's just the mana value. We can even use low mana value creatures with downsides and big bodies to get a very cheap effect from this. What I like about this most though is that it gives us a commander for a black-green self-mill deck that gives all of our creatures that really don't want to be in the graveyard an ability that makes them useful while they're there. Self-mill decks have all sorts of pieces that benefit from you milling yourself or benefit from things being in the graveyard, and then also has a number of effects that just don't. Some creatures can only use their things on the battlefield, and if they get milled over, are wasted space. Yes, they might be buffing something on the battlefield that cared that you milled them, but being able to then additionally add a bunch of counters is really, really cool. Oftentimes in self-mill decks, you really want to make sure that you are running cards that can still do something when they get mulled over, but not every card in your deck is going to be able to have that benefit. Being able to say that you don't even care if they end up getting milled or not is really powerful. And we've already talked about how counters do matter sometimes in green decks if we want to go that route. Thanks for making it to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed. I'm really excited for this set. I didn't think I would be so excited, but it's looking really good. I say that as if it's not out yet. It is. At the time of recording this, it's already out. But, yeah. Anyway, have a good night, everyone. I've been Darcy Bits. I'll catch you next time.